Hello and welcome to the Australian Institute of Insider Threats. This is the first week of GITM, known as the Global Insider Threat Awareness Month. Hi, my name is Boris Fisher and I'm the co-founder and CEO of the Australian Institute of Insider Threat. And today we have a very special guest. His name is Rod Crowder from OpsCenter. And we are going to be discussing the integration of insider threat into disaster recovery and business continuity. So first of all, welcome, Rod.
Thank you,
Fantastic to
Boaz.
see you.
Thanks for having me today. Welcome, pleasure to be here.
Yes. Rod, why don't you sort of give us an overview of yourself, your role, OpsCenter, and importantly, I'd like people to understand what does that actually mean by being a lead instructor of the Disaster Recovery International.
Cool. Yeah, so look, my core business is a business called OpsCenter, established around 20 years ago or so, just a little bit over now. And we basically specialize in risk and resilience planning. So we go into organizations, excuse me, we look at their risk postures, what they have in terms of current resilience. We help them build plans, we help them build mitigation strategies, put those in place, test them, exercise, and then maintain them. So effectively, we look at all the bad things that can happen to an organization and help organizations mitigate against the potential for disasters and incidents to occur. And that can be of a technical nature, but it can also be of a business nature as well. So some of the work we do is around technology infrastructure and IT and so on, and some of it is more around the sort of business aspect.
Yep.
We're associated or with the country representative, or I am personally the country representative of the Disaster Recovery Institute International. DRI is the oldest not-for-profit training and certification and awareness body in this space around business continuity and disaster recovery. We have 20,000 plus certified professionals around the world.
Wow.
And we're their representative here in Australia and New Zealand. So we run the certification and training courses on behalf of DRI in this region.
Brilliant. Brilliant. So let's get started. And what a better question to ask is, why should organizations consider including insider threat awareness as part of their disaster recovery and business continuity plans?
Interesting question. And BCP and BCP and DRP have traditionally been focused on premises. That's where it all started from, sort of back in the in the 80s and early 90s, whatever. Around everyone's coming to one location to work. All of the networks terminate there. All of the ITs there. All of the people there, and so on. And obviously, in this modern day age, things have moved on. And with particularly after COVID, a lot of organisations, white collar and so on, people can work from anywhere. So there's a much greater emphasis on data and information and things that insider people inside the organization have access to that data and information. So it's really important from enhancing the security posture of the organization to consider what insider risks are. It helps obviously to improve incident response, minimize downtime, minimize disruptions on the organization. And we also find that there's increasing number of compliance obligations as well. So organizations need to be able to demonstrate that they've actually assessed insider risks and insider threats, and sort of building a culture of, security aware in terms of those insider threats and risks. So yeah, it's really part of their holistic sort of risk management framework that, they consider insider threats as a specific type of threat, as opposed to all the others that can occur in business. Yeah.
From all the different type of risks that could be out there. So my next question is then, is it difficult, or how would you integrate insider threat awareness into these disaster recovery and business continuity plans?
Look, there's a couple of ways of building these plans and going about the process. DRI has a process, there's an ISO standard, et cetera, et cetera. Regardless of the specific type of risk, whether a threat, whether it's an insider threat or it's a flood or a fire or a pandemic, there's kind of a defined process. And really what you need to do with insider threat is integrate that into that existing process. So, if it's a flood in the building or it's a fire or it's whatever it might be. So really conduct a risk assessment. So make sure that you include critical assets and evaluate the insider threats as part of your risk framework. And following on from that, a business impact assessment. And they're two slightly different things. One is looking at, the actual risks that exist and whether they will occur or not. If they do occur, what is the actual impact on the business from an insider threat perspective? And then obviously make sure that you build those things into those individual plans, right? So your disaster recovery plans, your business continuity plans, And once you've built those, then it's about training, it's about awareness, it's about rollout, testing, exercising, and so on. But it's a very new and emerging risk, insider threat. A lot of our clients really sort of scratch their head when we say, "Have you considered insider threat?"
Yeah,
And
I was going to ask that question, which or a side question, which is
mm,
from your observation, do you see organizations actually look at it?
very, very rarely, Buzz, to be honest. It's really quite, as I say, a lot of them, it's a real light bulb moment. And we've been increasingly adding into the simulation. We do a lot of simulation, desktop simulation testing with our clients. So we
Yeah.
design scenarios around their premises, their people, their infrastructure, their products and services and so on. And we sort of say, oh, let's throw in an insider threat sort of aspect to this. And they sort of look at us and say,
Yeah,
you know, and then we sort of say, well, hey, we've got all these people walking in every day with all this privileged
correct.
access, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, it's something that doesn't seem to really, doesn't really feature very highly with a lot of our clients at the moment. So on their risk registers and frameworks, right? So
Yeah. Do you ever sort of raise sort of look here are the different types of insider threats that could, severely impact the organization? Or go through some examples, or what would they be some of the most common examples of insider threat incidents
mm-hmm.
that can impact an organization?
I guess look from our perspective, and there are different views on this, but I guess there's a couple of categories, major categories. There are accidental insider threats and the
Yes, correct,
deliberate threats, right? So
correct.
the things that people maliciously or deliberately set out to do to harm the organization or to get themselves ahead or get some credentials, access to whatever it might be. And then there's the accidental things. And I guess there's those two sort of broad categories.
Yes, yes,
There's malicious insider threats, so data theft or deliberate sabotage of systems, compromising credentials, trying to take over someone's account for some reason, trying to violate policies and that sort of thing. And then there's the kind of accidental ones where someone inadvertently, clicks on a phishing link or whatever it might be, or doesn't follow a procedure properly, inadvertently emails a confidential spreadsheet to somebody and it gets intercepted and so on. So I guess there's quite a few that again people don't necessarily think about all of these and what the impact on the organization will be from a business
yeah,
continuity
yeah.
perspective. And we actually had one client recently where someone was actually feeling very undervalued and they actually
Oh,
orchestrated an IT outage. Um, and suddenly they were the person that knew how to fix it to make them look like a hero and get her a promotion, right? And they were found out, but
oh,
it was a
wow.
very interesting case where someone, deliberately basically was feeling undervalued, feeling, that
Yes.
they weren't valued in the organization. So they literally deliberately went out and caused a compromise to, and then of course everyone's scrambling around and they were like, oh, I'll fix this. And so they can come from all sorts of different perspectives, right?
Yeah. So
Mhm.
normally I would start and sort of define the topic, but now I'm going to ask you this question, which is, can you sort of explain the role of disaster recovery and business continuity plan in terms of sort of insider threat mitigation?
Mhm. So look, BCP and DRP, and they're sort of they're interesting terms, and we've grappled with them throughout my whole career because people sort of disaster recovery planning. Why is that related to IT, and why is business continuity not
Yeah.
about IT and so on, right? So there's some interesting terms that we use in this
Yeah.
industry. Fundamentally, BCP is about keeping the lights on for the business. So what are the business functions, processes, operations, etc. And IT disaster recovery is really about keeping the technology running, right? So it's about
Yeah. Yeah.
networks, communications, application systems, data, access, and so on. And really, I guess put quite simply, businesses put in place a whole range of different sort of mitigating controls, policies, procedures, firewalls, antivirus, data loss protection, prevention, intrusion detection, etc., etc. And they're all designed to do a job to protect the organization, whether that's internally or externally. But sometimes those things fail. And sometimes if,
Yeah.
what if our defenses fail, is the sort of the wording I always use. That's when we're going to need a DRP and or a BCP to sort of put in place. Well, someone has broken into our network or that system has failed or this process can't be continued because of whatever reason, because of an insider threat and so on. So then, BCP and DRP is then basically that next stage of, well, how do we operate now we're compromised effectively, right? So
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. Mm.
Is there a sort of a strategy that you would recommend that um, the risk posed by insiders is not overlooked as part of the overall strategy for developing a disaster recovery and a business continuity?
Mm. Look, I think fundamentally it's really about making sure that you take a top-down approach.
Yeah.
Most organizations that we work with have an enterprise risk framework. If they don't have one, they should have. And that framework includes obviously a risk register and risk treatment plans and so on. But as we mentioned earlier, Boaz, not every organization has actually considered insider threats as part of that. But from a strategic perspective, I guess it's about looking at, on that risk register, you've got compliance risks and financial risks and technology risks, operational risks, et cetera, legislation and whatever, but adding that category of insider risk and threat and sort of analyzing, what are all those different sort of threats and scenarios that could occur from insiders,
Yeah.
having risk mitigation controls and plans, and then, taking those, putting them on your risk matrix in terms of
Yes.
grid and so on, top right quadrant in the Gartner world.
Yes.
You sort of say they're the most important ones. Let's develop risk treatment plans for those and have mitigation plans like, DRPs, BRP, business continuity plans, and so on. Mm.
Have you come across scenarios whereby an organization is going through some form of disaster recovery, but they're being circumvented or disrupted? I'm sort of we talk about insider threats of something happened and now we've got to recover. But what
Mhm.
about when the actual incident, the insider threat is taking at the point of time of the recovery?
Oh, so sort of a bit like looting, you mean? It's sort of
Yeah,
during the
well,
war or right? Or
let's say you've had a situation where you've had a data breach. Now you're recovering from the data breach, but
mm-hmm.
now you have someone who's intentionally trying to sabotage the recovery effort.
Mm. Interesting, very interesting. Yeah. Look, I haven't to be honest, I haven't sort of we haven't heard case studies of that, but I'm sure there are some. But look, I guess there's some mechanisms and so on that you can put in place to mitigate against that, right? From a BCP DRP perspective, making sure in your continuity plans that, confidential information is only shared on a need to know basis during the recovery, putting in place security and tools and methods so you're not using publicly accessible tools and you're restricting access to particular groups. You're enforcing all of the usual things like encryption, multi-factor
Yes,
authentication, least privilege access, data loss prevention, all those sorts of things. Yeah, as I say, the analogy is a bit like like you say, like sort of like looting during a war or a riot where people
yes, exactly,
smash into
exactly.
the shop windows and steal TVs and so on, right? So
Exactly,
yeah.
exactly. Because that was going to be my next question, which is basically how do you sort of ensure that the communication and collaboration during a disaster recovery or some form of continuity are secure from those that want to commit even further harm?
Mm. Well, again, I think that really comes down to making sure that people only have the access that they require, that is essentially needed, right? So, there's during a crisis, it's very much human nature to share everything with everybody.
Correct.
And when we develop crisis communication plans and strategies with our clients and we workshop this kind of thing, we often sort of say, "Whoa, put the brakes on here, guys. We don't need to be sharing all that information outside of the organization or even outside of the command team,
Correct.
as we call it, the executive team that's leading the crisis response." So I think really it's about making sure that the information that's disseminated to people is thought through, not just, blasting out things everywhere, and particularly to those people that have privileged access, because often there's a bit of confusion in these kind of scenarios as to, is this an insider threat or is it an
Yeah,
external
yes.
cyber incident or is it just a failed upgrade or an IT
Correct.
outage,
Correct.
etc. So it's not always clear where these incidents have come from and who's behind them. So you start sharing lots of information from during an insider threat or during an incident recovery, and potentially you can add more fuel to the fire, right? So
Exactly. I think especially in times of crisis where there's a lot of pressure, there's a lot of stress, people are thinking really maybe correctly
Mhm.
due to those situations emotionally
Mm.
as well, that I think there's maybe an assumption that they're happy to share and try and make it as easy as possible, but as you said, you could be adding fuel to the fire.
Mm. And very interestingly, just on that, and it's a little bit of a side topic, but it's in those really extreme crisis situations,
Yes.
your body has a defense mechanism, and I believe it's called a fugue state, FUGUE. And post 9/11, for example, it's so traumatic. People were being stopped in the street and asked their name and phone number, and they couldn't actually answer that. They're going to this extreme crisis mode where your body's trying to sort of shut things
Yes.
down.
Yes.
So, when you go into that sort of mode, That's obviously, you're sort of,
Yes.
trying to sort of contain that information
Yep.
and,
Yep. Yep.
keep it, yeah.
Yeah. I've often written about the flight of fright
Yep.
or fight.
Yes.
Usually there's a number of them, and one of them is called freeze.
Hmm.
So basically, it's your. Well, I won't explain it into too much details, but essentially, your mind basically is not sure what to do, and it's basically in a survival state.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
very much so.
Yep. Yep. For sure.
So, how do we maybe update sort of the BCP and the DR as
Hmm.
part of the insider threat awareness? Because I suppose on one side, when I look at it and I say, okay, not many organizations sort of realize or are aware
Hmm.
of the dangers coming from the insiders. And
Hmm.
yet there might be on the other side where you've got organizations that are doing something about it. But are they doing it in a way where, for example, we have regular cyber awareness training?
Hmm.
Would they do something similar with insider threat awareness and continuously update, review to see what works or not?
Yeah, I guess one of the key things is, when you're running simulations, you get a lot of really useful information out of simulation testing and exercising. Obviously, real events and near misses, all obviously also have a a role to play. But I think, learnings from post-incident reviews, whether
Yes.
they're simulations or they're real, in best practice around business continuity, although not always implemented, is to capture all of those actions and findings and so on out of the exercise and put them into an action register. So, as well as outlining things like the scenario and the participants and the timing and, what happened during the simulation, what are those prioritized actions and recommendations for improvement in terms of updating your business continuity plan, updating your disaster recovery plan, and so on. And generally, they get a lot of attention at the time you're doing the simulation because everyone's kind of in the moment and everyone really enjoys oh, wow, yeah, let's think about this. But what often happens is we find that, ongoing, people actually sort of forget about those things.
Yes,
They
that's
fall off
true.
the radar. So it's really important to make sure that you sort of capture all those key learnings. And then sort of sit down and say, right, what additional technical controls do we need? What policy changes do we need? What needs to be updated in our BCP or DRP to cater for the things that we've learnt, out of those specific, out of that specific incident or near miss, right? So,
Yeah. From a perspective of culture, is there much talked about when you provide consulting or expert advice around organization culture and what it means for disaster recovery and BCP?
yeah, yeah, and look, it often is very much, the culture of the organization is always a very interesting one. What we tend to find is the organizations that actually promote this from the top down, from the CEO level down, and the sort of executive team, and sort of absorb and take it on board and promote it and sponsor it and so on. They're the ones that really have the most success in this. Trying to push it up from the sort of bottom of the
Yes.
organization is always a challenge. But establishing things like clear policies and procedures, and reviewing them regularly, putting in place, robust training programs, promoting open communications, having a culture where employees are encouraged to speak out about different types of behavior that might be, anonymous reporting systems. Some of our clients actually sort of put in place things like, behavioral analytics and access monitoring and that sort of
Yeah.
thing. So there's lots of different ways of sort of creating that sort of, culture of awareness around different types of risks and insider threats, right?
So, so how do you sort of, maybe you might have seen it. How do you balance between, on one side you've got trust, on the other side you've got vigilance, but you were trying to foster a culture of sort of cooperation in line with insider threats and disaster recovery. Because one is about trying to get your people to do the right thing or shaping people to do the right thing. And the other thing is saying, okay, do you step, is there some form of policy or that they might feel, well, you're stepping over the line because you're sort of breaching my privacy or something like that.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? So I think, some of those things I talked about, sort of, I think particularly making sure that it's led from the top of the organization. Policies and procedures often don't really sort of cut it, to be honest, in experience. It's more about capabilities and awareness, and
Correct.
that people really sort of are taking this on, as opposed to sort of saying that we've got a written policy which is kind of gathering
Correct.
sort of dust
Correct.
on the shelf, right? So
Correct. Correct.
yeah, I think it's really important to sort of have those behavioral kind of things in the organization. Sure, you can have a policy and you can regularly audit that and you can update it and so on, but is that what people are going to do on a day-to-day basis?
Correct.
Rather than, collaborating across teams, again, promoting that open communication where people have the opportunity to sort of have a say, report things potentially anonymously where there might be incidents occurring that they think, hey, this looks like there's something a bit untoward here, but
Yes.
culture in the organization of, well, keep that to yourself and don't sort of, don't be the whistleblower,
Yes.
then that's
Correct.
obviously going to create, more friction than actually than solve problems in
Yeah.
this space, right? So
And from your observation and seeing a lot of organizations, um, have you noticed whereby certain maybe corporate policies haven't been followed, and is there a reason why um, that may be the case?
yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the biggest challenges with organizations, from particularly from a one of the challenges with BCPs and DR, disaster recovery and business
Yes.
continuity, to put it into this specific context, is they get very rarely used. It's not something that people enforce on a day-to-day basis.
Correct. Correct.
Corporate level, enterprise level disasters and crises are something that you hope never happen.
Yes.
But but
Correct.
but but at worst case, maybe happen, occasionally, once or twice a year. There's a building outage, or there's a threat from an insider around some sort of system, or there's whatever it might be. So generally, having lots of you know really beautifully documented plans and procedures and policies, which basically don't get looked at very often,
Yeah, you got it.
it's just not going to help. So people don't necessarily deliberately avert those policies and procedures. A lot of people don't even know they exist. That's one of the challenges, right? So, they
That's
just
so true.
they
That's so
just don't even know that there is a policy around. So again, when we're developing BCP and DRP, for example, we do training programs where we actually train people that have a role to play. So if they're a member of a response team or a disaster recovery team, they get sort of trained in that role. But we also have general awareness, and it's probably 10 or 15 minutes, maybe a
yes.
pre-recorded kind of video. Give this to all staff so that they're aware of, basically, that we have a business continuity framework. It includes things like insider threats, etc., as well as other risks. And what are the key sort of steps that they need to consider if there's some sort of incident.
Yeah, cool. Excellent.
Mm.
Last question. What is the key takeaway that you think regarding the topic of insider threat, awareness,
Mhm.
disaster recovery, and business continuity from your perspective?
The big thing from my perspective is organizations being aware that it is an emerging and real threat to the organization. I mean, there's lots of things we can talk about in terms of, policies
Correct.
and plans and testing and training, whatever. But I think the biggest thing that we see is, as I think I mentioned at the start, organizations haven't really thought about the fact that, all these people are walking in the front door every day. Sure, when they joined the organization, they went through a screening process and a background check and reference checks and all the rest of it. But
Yes.
could have been, 6 months ago, it could have been 20 years ago. Who knows?
Yes.
That's kind of irrelevant. But they're the ones that are walking in with all this privileged access to
Correct.
confidential information. A lot of people move around organizations and keep those privileges with them. So, you get moved from one department to another, but you don't necessarily get things revoked. And organization, so people are sitting in a role with way too much access than they probably really require. And it's okay, I've got access to that. I can get you a copy of this, et cetera, et cetera. And I just think the awareness level, particularly at the sort of, from the executive level down, is at the moment is really not quite there. So I think, if there's a key takeaway, it's about making organizations understand that insider threat and risk is something that really needs to be incorporated into
Yes.
kind of programs, right? It's
Oh,
really.
very much so. I totally agree with that.
Hmm.
So the good thing is, Op Center, and I'll get you to mention a little bit about it. Um, is providing 3 specific training courses as part of the Australian Institute of Insider Threat. Do you want to sort of briefly elaborate what these 3 courses are?
Sure. So yeah, the 3 courses are basically incident response, disaster recovery planning, and business continuity planning. Obviously, some organizations, call a consultant. Some try to do it internally themselves. And for those that want to do that, sort of a training course and certification is a great path. Not everybody wants to, use consulting external expertise to build these types of frameworks and programs. So the first course is really about, what's the incident response? And some incidents are managed within an incident management framework, and some may lead to a disaster or a business continuity response being required. So the first and most important thing is, when you discover an incident, how do you respond? What are the communications? What are the team structures? What are the policies, procedures, protocols? What are the escalation paths, and so on? So that's really what the incident response is about. So we, in this training course, basically help organizations to understand how to put that incident response framework together, how to assess the risks, how to assess the incidents, how to train people, test them, and so on. So that's training course number one. Training course number two is about disaster recovery. And as mentioned at the start, that's really about the recovery of technology, infrastructure, and applications. So if the incident gets out of control effectively, and we need to invoke that, that next step, then if it's systems and impacted, or it's data, or it's networks, or it's communications protocols, or it might be, then from a technology perspective, how do we recover that? Where do we recover it? What's the responsibilities, and so on? And that's obviously a very complex picture these days with SaaS and cloud and on-prem and
Yes.
different types of networks and people working from home. So there's a lot in there in terms of, and it's not really a very technically led course, the disaster recovery. It's really more about how to structure that overall plan and so on. What do the playbooks look like? Again, what are the escalations? What do the teams look like, and so on? And then the business continuity course is really about that next level again, which is from a BCP perspective, regardless of the technology impacts, how do we actually keep our functions and processes running? So again, this course takes people through how to do a business impact analysis, how to sort of, put in place plans, strategies, how to test them, how to train, and so on. So yeah, lots of really useful information in those courses based on best practices and industry standards.
Yeah.
But we always try to rely to things like ISO and NIST and all those sort of
Yeah.
different standards in the industry. So,
But to make it a little bit more interesting, I think these courses are sort of more tailored around the insider threat. So what could someone do internally that could cause harm to the organization? So
oh, absolutely, that's right. Yeah. So there's a whole range of different. Yeah. So there are obviously a lot of generic courses out there from BCP, incident response, etc. But as you say, so I should have made that clear. But that's very much the focus. Is from an insider threat perspective, what are those response mechanisms are key? Obviously, we cover some of the broader ones because some people come to these courses and not understand the broader sort of gamut of what are all the different types of incidents. So we do give people an awareness of what those different incidents may be. What their considerations are, but then obviously drill down into those specifics around, what does an insider threat response plan look like? What does an insider threat DRP look like, and so on. Yeah. So
brilliant.
Yeah.
Now, Rod, if someone wants to reach out to you directly, what's the best way? We can have this information with this video, but if they want to reach out to Op Center, what's the best?
So our website is OpCenter, and that's with the Australian spelling, TRE, not TER.com. And you can reach me at rod.crowder at opcenter.com. You'll also find me on LinkedIn quite easily. They're probably the two easiest ways to get in touch with us. Yeah.
Cool. Well, I hope you liked our discussion, and
absolutely.
and thank you for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for the opportunity. I really appreciate it. Again, I think it's a really key area which we're seeing a lot of growing interest in, and probably, as I say, quite a lot of misunderstanding. So I think it's a really timely topic to be talking about, and raising the importance and the awareness with the corporate world and government and so on as well. So thanks for the opportunity to
I totally agree. Yeah, I totally agree with what you just said. So yes, it's become very topical. Thank you again, Rod. We will chat with you soon.
Sure.
And all the best.
Thank you.
See you soon.
We sure will. Thank you.
Thank you.